Now, the migration amendment bill that was introduced today by Andrew Giles, what do you make of that? A very hard line, trying to circumvent another
the High
court-inspired
the High Court
problem.
The High Court have made a decision. I think it shocked the Liberals. I think it was their legislation. Then we moved a string of amendments at short notice, encouraged and supported by the Liberals. But I think this one will give the certainty that we can't have this situation where people can just say, I can't go home, I refuse to cooperate, and therefore they get to stay, because that is an open invitation to people smugglers to just say, look, it'll be tough for a few years, you just got to tough it out on an island or, somewhere, and this legislation sends a very clear message to people smugglers: end your trade, there is no value, you can't sell this brochure with Australia's name on it, forget it.
Dan Tehan's going to join us in a moment, Michael, but you would imagine that even though the coalition will say, oh, this is a mess, you're rushing it and so on, they would be supporting this before the Parliament rises ahead of Easter this week, you'd imagine.
Of course, they must support the legislation. It's got some very important elements in it, as Stephen has just said. I mean, people that don't cooperate with the authorities, that have no valid right to stay here, their country won't cooperate with them. I mean, the basic tenets of this legislation appear to me to be correct. The only problem is that, why do I get the impression that Mr Giles is not really on top of his brief? Everything is hurried, last minute, etc., panicked, which of course creates, serious complications in the Senate, because you're asking the senators, particularly the guy from the ACT, you're asking individual senators who've got to be across every single portfolio with limited staff now to read this legislation, understand it and vote on it tonight. It puts enormous pressure on the independents, which is why you need, as Dan Tehan and James Paterson have said correctly, you actually need time to read these bills, formulate what amendments you need, and not throw it through the reps and then the Senate, because you put the legislation at risk.
If I could just remind Michael, I was in the Parliament when John Howard, at 6 o'clock in the evening, called Kim Beazley in and presented him with a bill called the Tampa Bill, and said, I want this passed. I'm tabling it at 7 tonight in the House of Reps. I want it passed by tomorrow. I spoke at 2:30 in the morning in the Senate on this bill. So, Michael, migration bills have a long history of being rushed through Parliament. So I spoke at 2:30 in the morning on the floor of the Senate about John Howard's original Tampa legislation.
You could be making a prescient forecast.
Very good speech it was, Steve.
Might be a long sitting tonight.
John Howard didn't introduce legislation every month. He didn't panic legislation every month. The Tampa arrived, it needed to be dealt with. But this guy Giles is introducing this panic legislation every month or so. I mean, you get no impression he's on top of things.
Michael, you're gilding the lily here. The Liberals demanded that there be, and the media, particularly the Sydney media, demanded that this legislation should have been ready. It should have been. We hadn't even seen the decision, reasoning. Okay, and people tried to make that point. Didn't stop the Liberal Party saying Labor's incompetent. The media saying Labor's incompetent. They should have known this was coming. They should have had the bill drafted before the reasons. And the reason we've had some of the problems is because the Liberal Party wanted to play politics and simply demand a legislative fix without even seeing the reasons for the original decision. So we've got them. This is legislation that looks pretty clear-cut.
We've got to wrap it up. Stephen, Michael, thanks. See you next week.